So I'm going to be talking about insects and diseases, but first I'm going to start off with a lot of what you've already heard about climate change because it's the primer that sets the stage. A lot of these things I'm going to be talking about are native, they're on the landscape. At endemic levels, they're not a problem. It's when we create a stressful situation, they become opportunistic. Climate change, listening things like drought, that makes these insects, it gives them a buffet, and so they can explode. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit with what you've already heard, and maybe some things that you're not thinking about in terms of mechanisms. So that's really important. The majority of the calls that I get from landowners are the insects are killing my trees, and typically when I go and look at it, I'm like, no, there's a different primary factor, and the insects are secondary to that. So don't treat the insect, treat the primary factor. So if you go home from this talk, the one thing I want you to take home is treat the primary stressor. And oftentimes it's not the insects, it's not the disease, it's something else that set up the stress stage. Okay, so starting off, what is predicted with climate change? You've heard a lot about that already, but it bears reiteration. So increasing CO2, increasing average temperature and duration. I'm going to drill down more on that because it's not, as was discussed by Holly, it's not just peak high temperature. It's not just peak low temperature, dry days. It's the duration, the timing. That's what's really impactful. Decreasing precipitation in the summer and increasing in the winter, although in the form of rain, not snow. And so that has a big impact when you're talking about needing that snowpack to recharge waterways later on in the season or water the trees as they slowly melt up in our mountain ranges. More flooding, catastrophic events like landslides and drought. And unfortunately, it means less skiing and more wildfires. So there are a lot of different things this is impacting. It's not just ecology, it's aesthetics, it's economics. This is a huge deal that's affecting every aspect of our lives. We know a lot already. Do we know everything? No, we have a lot of models. Some of them are wide-ranging to the point where it feels like they don't really tell us much of anything. It's like it could be catastrophic or not that bad. Let's pick somewhere in between, run with that data, and start applying it on the landscape, at least on the small scale. We still are on this upward slope that I think that we still have time to affect some change, and maybe I'm just trying to put a silver lining on it. But we definitely have a lot of application at our hands. We have a lot of data that we can start applying this stuff on the landscape. So you've seen some of these maps already, but I'm going to provide some links later in case you're not looking at them. You should be. It's a great way to keep tabs on what's current, what's happening, so that you can give your clients the most up-to-date information, because they may not, and definitely probably are not reading this information for themselves. They are asking you to distill it as the technical experts. So as I mentioned, it's not just about peak temperatures. It's not just about having some dry days. It's what's the duration of that, what's the intensity of that, and what's the timing of that. So for example, when trees are going to sleep in the winter, they need some moisture to bear them over for that hibernation period. So having a very dry end of the summer, a lot of hot days, a lot of dry days in a sequence, really stressful versus a peak day here or there of high temperatures. And then when they wake up in the spring, again, having a dry or a warm spring, that much more stressful. So timing of these events is really important. When they have that thirst, they need some replenishment. And timing of moisture in terms of, you get a whole bunch of rain and you think, oh, the trees are going to perk up. So this year we had 1 year of a bit more rain than we've had in the past, still not at average normal levels. But it was more rain, so that's great for the trees, but is it enough? No, because we did have a lot of dumps of rain at short periods of time. So you can't drink all the water you need for the week on Monday and call it good, neither can trees. They need a long, slow watering. This is not what's happening. It's just an immediate wash through of rain, and that it's actually even more stressful to get water in that way. And so these maps are ways you can stay on top of it. As was shown earlier, monitoring them. You don't have to look at it weekly, but look at it monthly. Just see how that's progressing. But even more easily, you can access this information via this monthly email. So that one link, and I'm going to provide you with a lot of links. I think these presentations will be shared, so you don't have to write everything down. But this email is a great way to stay on top of the current events if you aren't already monitoring drought for yourself. really easy to go by how we're feeling about something. So this past year, a lot of people are saying, oh, it feels like we're back to normal again. And if you look at this information, we are not. The majority of the state has been in a drought still this past year. So we've had higher than normal temperatures, we've had lower than normal precipitation, but it feels better than it has in the past years since 2012 when we started this intensive drought, because we're just going about how we feel about it, what we've seen, because we become more accustomed to the way that things have turned. And so this is a good way to stay on top of what are the numbers actually telling us, what is actually being seen, so that you're giving that information to your landowners rather than going, well, it feels like it's been rainier. I think things are in the up and up. We're going to have these peak years when things are a little bit better or sometimes a little bit worse, but the overall trend, as you're seeing, is increasing temperatures over a duration and decreasing precipitation at the time and the duration that we need it. So how is climate change, specifically drought, impacting trees themselves? What's that mechanism there? Moisture and heat stress, increased CO2, which actually can increase growth for trees, but it also increases their water need. So increased CO2, decreased precipitation, that's not promoting growth. And what's been seen is that even though CO2 can increase growth of trees, it's really going to be negated by all these other negative factors that are decreasing growth in trees. So when you have warmer temperatures, for example, and less precipitation, stomata close, and so the tree is no longer losing a lot of moisture through their stomates, but they're also no longer making food. That's a reduction in growth. So it negates any sort of positive impacts from CO2 increase. So as I mentioned, that stomatal closure. So just to explain a little bit, if you aren't already familiar with the mechanisms of how trees get water and how they retain water, what they do with it, and why drought is so impactful, think of a tree in terms of a network of straws. So it's got these vascular tissues and these little tubes that are pulling up moisture through the roots, up through the tree to the canopy, where it's released through stomata in the leaves, lost through evapotranspiration during photosynthesis. Okay, so the tree is drinking up water. When you lose some of those straws or lose some of those roots because of drought stress or other impacts such as mechanical damage, root compaction, anything that might damage those tissues, you're reducing, one, the amount of water that can be pulled in through the roots if you have root loss, or the amount of water that can be moved throughout the tree through those vascular tissues. Every time we have a droughting event, you're going to have dieback of those fine roots that are pulling up the moisture. You're going to have breakage of those tubes, those vascular tubes that are pulling up that moisture, and that's not rebuilt immediately. That takes time. The tree has to grow. What does it need to rebuild those things? More water, but it doesn't even have those tissues intact to bring in more of that water. So again, another analogy that might help to think about it, if you twist an ankle, even if it heals up, you're back to normal, which ankle do you think is stronger in the future? Is it the one that you've twisted in the past or the one that's never been twisted? Probably the one that had a little bit of damage in the past. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of yes, but there's scar tissue and sometimes it can strengthen. Just generally, once damaged, that damage is there. So these trees, if there's a droughting event, they've had some broken vascular tissues, they've had to rebuild later on, but they still don't have the amount that they started out with. And so they're inherently going to be more susceptible to future droughting events or other stressors that come along. So drought is impactful not only in the immediate sense, so it's an acute damage, but it's also chronic over the long term. And that's why we see trees dying 3, 5, 10 years down the road after droughting events, when that was the primary stressor that set it off. And maybe things like insects and disease were opportunistic upon those stress trees, but drought is that primary factor. Getting back to the mechanisms, when trees' responses are to close their stomata, when they close them depends. There are isohydric and anisohydric variations amongst trees in terms of when they close those stomata and how long they can last throughout the drought. I'm not going to get into those technical details, but basically whenever the stomata close, they're no longer actively photosynthesizing, and so then they starve. So it's retain moisture or starve. That's not a great balance. It's hard to choose which one can you do without and for how long. In addition, when you are not performing those functions, such as photosynthesizing, you don't have carbon to allocate towards not only growth, but all the secondary things after growth. Once growth is fulfilled, where else does carbon go? It goes to defenses. So if a tree is already stressed enough that it's not growing well, then it doesn't have defenses, and it's that much more susceptible. Altered phenology is a big one, especially when we talk about insects and disease. So as the climate changes, we have some differences in when bud break might occur, and that might or it may make it actually, could be a positive or a negative factor as it relates to insects and disease and their phenology and how they sync up. So sometimes it could be good. Bud break could happen really early, and then the insects don't catch up in time to start feeding really early on. Other times it's a negative factor, as I'll get into, such as the natural enemies are being affected that in terms of asynchrony. They're not able to catch up to the insect pests. So there are a lot of different variables here in terms of what can happen in those relationships. And then shifted, or I forgot the longer growing season. So sometimes the seasons are extended. Trees wake up a little sooner, and then they go into dormancy a little bit later. That's that much longer. They're also exposed to insects and disease that are also active. And then shifted distribution or range, as we talked a lot about with the seed source tools. That's a really complicated one. I'm not going to get into assisted migration and all of that because it's really technical, and there are a lot of different pieces there. And I don't think we can brush with such a broad brush in terms of saying, yes, we absolutely can use this one genotype here broadly. It's complicated, and we need to take things slowly. So I mentioned the mechanisms of how things like drought directly impact trees. So collapsing vascular systems, reduced roots, and then fewer resources for growth and defense. I often get the question, well, how come this tree died and this tree didn't? They're planted at the same time, the same species, they're close to each other. There are also a lot of other factors at play here. Genetics have a big role in this. It determines what the physiology and morphology of the tree is. How many vascular bundles do they have? What is the physiology of those vascular bundles? How efficient are they at pulling moisture throughout the tree, translocating it throughout the tree's canopy? Any sort of morphology of the leaves. Is it a very dense leaf? Is it a wide spread out leaf? There are a lot of different factors that are related to the genotype, the growing conditions, microclimate, and that's aside from any other effects that we're not even seeing. What's going on below the ground? What does the soil look like? And I'll get into that. Is there hardpan under this one tree? It's really hard to know. So it's hard to make these decisions in terms of, well, these are long-term crops. If your rotation age is 70 years, you got to make a lot of decisions that are far-reaching. And so how are you able to make those decisions when you can only see externally what's going on with this tree? It is very difficult. We're all in a very tight spot. So I put this slide in here because I think there's a lot of confusion as to how to determine if drought is having an impact on trees versus insects or disease. Drought does have some really telltale signs and symptoms, so it can be easy to determine because there isn't a whole lot of overlap with different insects and disease, because oftentimes you will see signs of insects and disease that are very obvious, piles of frass from insects that have bored in, fungal like hyphae that you'll see in the tissues. So it's obvious, you see those signs. Drought, it's hard to see the signs of drought. You only have metrics to go by. You can see visually it's dry, but you really need to rely on the symptoms. And so what's key here is that think about what I was saying with how drought impacts a tree. What tissues does it kill? What do those tissues do? That's how you determine what the symptoms should look like. So top kill, branch dieback, flagging. Think about water having to move throughout the tree. The furthest tissues that water has to travel, if it's not getting there, that's what dies first. So you have top kill, dieback, flagging. Oftentimes with insects, trees will die very fast, so it's a span of 1 year. You might see a little top kill, but then the whole thing turns red. That drought is a slow burn. It's a little bit slower in terms of how it's shown symptomatically. A thinning crown, so when trees are thirsty, they will close those stomates, and as I mentioned, photosynthesis goes down, those leaves start dying, or the tree will just drop the leaves prematurely to retain moisture because they are moisture suckers. They suck up the moisture and release it. So dropping those needles is actually a drought response that can help save the tree, but then the more needles you drop, obviously that hampers growth. Twigs start dying back, branches start dying back. So if you haven't noticed already, just driving down I-5 from Portland down to Douglas County, you'll look in the side of the road and you see all these Doug-fir that look really wonky. They have very asymmetrical, pretty cruddy looking crowns. That's what's happening there. Some of them are a little bit wind beaten, but it's a drought stress response. They have an asymmetrical crown because you don't lose needles and branches evenly. You'll have all the needles lost in this one branch, and then that branch goes, and then the other one's dies on the other side, and then slowly they drop, and so you have a weird symmetry to the crown. The top might die back, and so maybe the second lateral will take over as the central leader, and it looks a little crooked. So take a look, and I hate to do this to you because now you cannot unsee it. You're going to look at every Doug-fir and go, oh my gosh, they all look terrible. This species will not survive. We're hoping it will, obviously. It's our state tree. But there are certain areas in which, yeah, it's probably going to be pushed out of it. Maybe shouldn't have been there in the first place. We've gotten used to seeing it growing in areas that are historically oak savannas, but they should not be there. But we've just gotten used to it, and we need to start thinking about what actually is doing well there right now, project that forward. Moving on, stress cones, so just an overproduction of cones. Sometimes that's hard to identify, but if you see a thin canopy and what looks like a lot more cones relative to maybe a nearby tree, that's a stress cone response. Leaf scorch in the broadleaves, so again, it's kind of the same idea with moisture need to move to the edge of the leaves. That part curls and dies first. Mortality across species, especially similarly drought intolerant species. So the table that you saw earlier showing the levels of drought tolerance for different species. If you're seeing the multiple trees in that less drought tolerant box at a site not doing well, and look at the understory. What type of plants are growing there? Let that indicate to you what does well at that site or what is being stressed at that site, rather than jumping directly to insects or disease, maybe an abiotic response to things like drought. Okay, other factors that interact with drought. So there are, we always want to point to one stress factor, but oftentimes there are multiple things overlapping that just increase stress over time. So previous stresses, so things like drought, they impact the tree immediately, so it makes it more susceptible to insects and disease, but also it makes it less able to rebound thereafter and in the future to repeated attacks. It's less resistant and less tolerant. Soil type is big. We haven't talked about that a lot today, but that is huge. So we have some sites where there's a lot of moisture, but if the soil isn't retaining the moisture long enough for the roots to absorb it, it's not useful. Look at the soil type. That's really important. Topography and site microclimates. Many landowners have areas where there are patches of different microclimates, and they may not be able to grow red cedar or Doug-fir across their landscape or across their ownership, but there are microsites when they probably can. So you can retain them in the draws, but maybe the south-facing slopes or the ridges, avoid them there. Timing, duration, and quickness of change. So it's kind of what I mentioned with getting a whole dump of water. Also, if you have cooler temperatures and then all of a sudden we have a peak in high temperatures, that stress exacerbates any previous drought stress. Drought mortality has been increasingly found to be positively correlated with tree height. That seems like we know that, but sometimes we need multiple studies to tell us that to finally start stating it as a fact. Vegetation cover, that's been talked about with thinning, especially when you have an intensive thinning project where you come through and remove a lot of that material. Yeah, there is a drying effect in the soil. And so think about the intensity at which you are applying some of these management strategies. And then high winds, high wind, high sun exposure, that's exacerbated. The stress of that is exacerbated, especially in drought-prone sites. Okay, so what are the direct implications of climate change on insects? So earlier emergence, later diapause. So they could wake up earlier, conditions are better a little bit earlier for them, and they might go to sleep a little bit later. That means they have more time to feed. For some of them, it also means more time to reproduce more generations. Altered synchrony with hosts and natural enemies, so they could wake up a little bit earlier and get on those trees right as bud break occurs, which might be earlier than is typical. And so those trees don't even have a chance to fully expand their buds and start photosynthesizing. As I mentioned, the longer feeding periods, higher fecundity, and moving into shorter life stages and more generations possible. I want to make it really clear, we're not going to have a warmer year and then all of a sudden an insect that biologically has 3 generations a year will magically pop out 4. That does not happen. That happens over evolutionary time. So we need to not think of like, oh my gosh, every year we could just have explosions of insects. There are some insects that have multiple generations a year, and some of that is dictated by how much time that they have to produce and what the conditions are like, how much of a food source they have that they can put out multiple generations. Aphids are a great example of that. They're also a kooky example in which they can have multiple generations within the same individual. It's called telescoping generations. So the mother, I should say grandmother, is pregnant with the daughter that is already pregnant with the granddaughter. I know it's creepy. So there are some insects that can be very oppressive should conditions suit them, that they can churn out multiple generations. This is not true of things like bark beetles that we see in the forest system. Bark beetles have defined biological numbers of generations. Over time, they can increase how many generations they put out. Sometimes they'll have, they can't complete into 3 full generations, but maybe it might be 2.5. So they might go into winter diapause at a different stage. So rather than getting to all the way to the adult stage, they might stop at the pupal stage, so you get 2.5 generations out. So that can happen, but I really want to stress that is over a long period of time. Reduce winter mortality, so late freeze events are really important, really helpful for depressing pests, and we are having fewer and fewer of those. The reason why they're so important, because as we get closer to spring, some insects are still developing. Even though they're technically hibernating, they are still developing. And so they get closer and closer to those stages that are less hardy in cold temperatures. And so if you will have, they think they're supposed to wake up biologically, but then there's a cold snap and then a bunch of them die. That's really helpful, especially for some of our non-natives, and I'll show you an example of that, to try and depress those insects late in their process. And range shifts. So there was a paper that assessed about 99 species, just a variable mix of mammals, insects, and plants, looking at range shifts, and they found an average move per decade of 6 kilometers or 6 meters in elevation per decade. That is a huge shift. And I caution you, we throw these numbers at you that we're going to have this much change in temperature over time and this much shift of species over time. Think of it relative to stand rotation. So as I mentioned, this is a long-lived crop. We're not talking about annuals that we're growing each year. This is something that you need to predict out 60, 70, 150 is what I heard, years out. So that's a lot of change that can happen. So if you have a 60-year rotation and a species can shift even 6 meters in elevation every decade, so you have 6 times that, that's a lot. So I'm going to go through some case studies, and I have no clue what time it is, so hopefully I'm not anywhere near to going over. These are things that we have been seeing. I get a little frustrated when we talk about climate change. We need to actually address it, but we don't really know exactly what's happening and what impacts it's having. Yes, we do. We are seeing examples of this, and I think sometimes we're scared to lay claim to it and say, yes, that is a direct impact of climate change. I'm going to go ahead and risk it. This is a direct impact of climate change. So spruce aphid is a non-native insect. It's been established in the West Coast for many years. It's from Europe. But it's a little aphid. Pictures of the top left here, very tiny. It attacks Sitka spruce in Oregon, other types of spruce in other areas, but it's found along the coastline. It can also attack Engelmann spruce on the east side. We typically see it in our Sitka, but it's here every year. We've had it since the 20s. But this year, who has seen brown Sitka spruce along the coast? Quite a few, and it's extensive. When we flew aerial survey this year, looking down, it was just a sea of brown when it should have been green. These trees are not dead. These insects are feeding on old needles. So you can see in the middle picture that the green needles were the current year's growth. The spruce aphid cannot feed on those needles, even though they're high nitrogen content, which they love. They are also highly defended. They have a lot of secondary metabolites to defend them because they are the most susceptible young, fresh, luscious tissues. So the insects cannot feed on those, luckily. So they strip the tree of all these other needles by sucking out the juices. But the tree can still live because it's got 1 year of growth. Conifers need at least 2 to 3 years of needle retention to keep thriving. Having 1 year of needle retention can't last long. So they'll last until next year, but what happens next year when these insects blow up again? And so why did they blow up in the first place? Like I said, they've been here for a long time, but they aren't native. And so we don't have a lot of specific natural enemies for them, diseases, natural controls. The only controls that we have, and there are natural enemies that do go after them, they're generalists, but because they're not specialists, they don't have huge impacts on depressing their populations alone. So the only thing that we have to control these insects are cold snaps. And so what we saw the winter before last, well, not this current winter, but previous winter, that we did not have the typical cold snaps that we see in the north coast. We did in the south coast, and we did not see this insect down there. It's present, but not at these levels. But in the north coast, they blew up. And so if we have another year where we have a mild winter, these insect populations, they can continue, they'll make it through the winter. We don't have a cold snap. The populations, they're healthy, thriving, and then that's that many more to start the next generations. That's a direct implication of climate change. We're seeing that right there. We've seen this in the past. Trees have rebounded. I'm sorry if this is the sky is falling, because it's not. We have seen this insect blow up before across even larger acreage, but this is devastating because when you think about it, if it's related to climate change, which I'm saying it is, we're going to see more and more of these events. So how many times can we see Sitka spruce get defoliated? Sequentially, only a few years. But even if we have a 5-year gap where we don't see these insects and then they pop back up again, that tree has already been damaged by this stress before. So it's just an additive effect. This is a native insect. It's found throughout the state, but we're seeing it ramp up as a more intensive mortality factor, whereas before it was secondary at best. It would only go after the most stressed trees. Mostly these trees were growing on very, very droughted sites, or they were extremely fire damaged trees, a lot of bowl scorch, a lot of crown scorch, dead campium. But now we're seeing it in areas in which the Douglas-fir was actually didn't have any apparent symptoms of dying. That it was actually doing pretty well despite, especially in the Applegate area, growing on serpentine soils, rocky ridges where it's pretty stressful. Those trees were still getting by, but all of a sudden we started seeing the numbers of flathead fir borer killed trees increasing after 2012. Now, again, this is an opportunistic insect, but it's just becoming, the buffet is getting larger for this insect. And so as you can imagine, it can increase to numbers that are not sustainable. And so that's when you have an outbreak effect. So endemic levels are okay, but if you have insects build to such numbers that they can overcome tree defenses, then you have an outbreak and they can spill over into otherwise healthy trees that would have made it. But they're just being attacked by sheer number. That's how bark beetles work, in that a lot of these trees, if they're healthy, they are not susceptible to these insects. They have defenses intact, mainly sap flow, which is a mechanical and chemical barrier against insects and the fungi that they vector. But if you have any reduction in that sap flow, such as things from drought, that's less defense that it has against these insects, and then these insects will take advantage of that. In the case of bark beetles, they use chemical communication, they bring in their buddies, and so if you have a whole bunch of stressed trees, a few bark beetles will check it out, and then they'll call to their buddies, come on over, this one's fine, and then they all attack that tree en masse, and no matter how healthy that tree is, it cannot repel that many insects. So Douglas-fir bark beetles, so remember I mentioned that with climate change, it's not just a factor of changing temperature and precipitation, it's also more erratic events in terms of weather events. So one of these things, we saw this last winter in a lot of parts of the valley where we saw extreme tree blowdown. Also snow damage, ice damage from these trees. In large diameter Douglas-fir, this is a problem because the Douglas-fir bark beetle, which is native, it's present across the state. In endemic levels, it's okay. It just picks off the most stressed trees, so it naturally thins the forest. People don't like me to say that, but it is serving an ecological purpose that we want. But at large numbers, it overwhelms trees and it gets into the otherwise healthy trees, but it really likes these blowdown trees. So anytime you have blowdown events, these beetles are attuned to that. They see it, they attack it, their next generation pops out and hits adjacent standing trees that are green that may have otherwise made it, but there's such a population overload that they then get overwhelmed. Yeah. Did you say burned? Unburned slash piles. So they need a large diameter. Usually like 6 dBH is the base level that they can attack or want to attack because they need a thick phloem to feed on. But typically it's somewhere more in the range of 12 to 14 that they'll attack. They're not going after the branches. There are other insects that will go after the branches, but they don't typically outbreak like Douglas-fir beetle does. And I can get into more the nuts and bolts of that with you later, but there is a product, MCH, an anti-aggregation pheromone, that if you do create those piles, you can slap that on it and it repels them. So I just wanted to list some of the majors that we're seeing direct linkages with drought on the landscape. So Douglas-fir beetle, Douglas-fir pole, and engraver beetles, and that's the insects in the smaller diameter material, flathead fir borer, that's in Douglas-fir. In true fir, it's fir engraver. Typically, when you see fir engraver, if you see a true fir and there are a whole bunch of horizontal ashes, that's the gallery. That is very recognizable once you've seen it. Again, don't go after the insect. What are the predisposing factors why that insect is at such a high number at that site? Typically with grand fir, it's being grown low in the valley where it's too intermittently dry. There could be a root disease factor as well, but typically there's some other precursor that's bringing those insects in. And then in pine, it's ips. Now, I didn't go over a lot of other insects. You can find that on our website because there are a lot to go through, but these are the main ones that have landscape level impacts. The defoliators tend to be a bit more short-lived on the west side, so we're going after things like bark beetles that tend to be more problematic. So getting into diseases, temperature and moisture changes can have an influence on pathogen presence or virulence, but it could be positive or negative. It really depends on what the disease is. For example, with a fungus, fungi really like moist conditions, but they also like warm conditions. So you might have moisture, but if it's really hot, they're not going to like that as much. So it really depends on what disease you're talking about in terms of, is it going to be positively or negatively influenced by drought or climate change. Again, altered phenology, so the timing of sporulation, that's dependent upon the moisture and temperature conditions. Any synchrony diseases might have with an insect vector. So if an insect is required to carry a disease from place to place, when does that insect emerge? If that's altered by any sort of climate change impacts, then that also then alters not just the insect, but the disease that it's carrying. Pathogens are really well adapted for evolving quickly because they reproduce really quickly, they develop very quickly. Relative to the long-lived hosts, such as trees, they can be more immediately impacted by any changes in climate or weather relative to trees. And same thing goes, altered distribution and range, because you think about what are the things that carry some of these diseases. Is it water flow, for example? That's a big one. So if you have reduced water flow, it actually might be beneficial that you don't have this disease, such as a Phytophthora, being able to travel through these ephemeral streams. Sorry to put a positive spin on climate change, but there's some pros and cons here. So some specific examples, so sudden oak death, that's a Phytophthora, it's a waterborne mold. And Swiss needle cast, various needle blights and blister rust are heavily impacted by temperature and moisture in terms of, is this the right climate that they can develop in, and can they travel in this climate? Because some of them require moisture, and some of them it's a temperature gradient. Temperature and moisture also affect host resistance. So can that tree compartmentalize that disease? Can it push it out through sap flow? How well is it able to rebound after a disease takes hold? It all depends on how much basically that tree, how much moisture that tree has to build up those defenses. This is just one of those examples of diseases and their vectors. So any sort of impact with temperature and precipitation that has a direct effect on the insect will also have a secondary impact on the diseases that it vectors. And this image just shows some of the fungal vectors that are carried by bark beetles, for example. So I wanted to bring up a few of these cases that we really aren't sure what's going on, but we think it might, we're pretty sure it's abiotic, but we cannot directly pin it to climate change or drought. But we're looking into it, and we'd like to hear more from you on what you're seeing on the ground. But red cedar, so from Oregon through Canada, we're seeing pockets of red cedar dieback, particularly in areas where red cedar should be thriving along streams and shaded understory or overstory. But it's not. It's dying, and we don't know why, because there are no major insect or disease vectors that we've isolated consistently. So there's no pattern there. And speaking for diseases, there are a few diseases that are primary mortality agents for red cedar, but red cedar is a pretty insect-resistant tree. There are insects that will attack it, but typically only when the tree is dead or dying. So if that tree is thriving, then it should not have a heavy load of insects, just the endemic level, and that's what we're seeing. And so a lot of these sites, the insect load is still at an endemic level, even though the tree is heavily stressed. And so the symptoms that we're seeing mainly are thinning canopy of red cedar. And you might see relative to adjacent red cedars, some of them still have a full canopy, but you'll see this progression of mortality that's similar to a root disease, where you'll see some thinning, maybe some flagging, some totally dead trees, but then in the same area you see some completely healthy trees because it seems to be an outward growing spread. But we have not isolated any diseases from that. What we think might be happening, because remember I mentioned it's growing along streams, is that even though there is moisture there, if you have any drop in that flow level in the stream, that's still sending the tree into a drought-like effect. So it's not the same amount of water that it was used to. It is decreasing. Is there still water there? Yes. But is it enough for what it was used to? No. So that might be contributing to drought symptoms, even though the tree still has water there. Could be that maybe years and years of drought have finally depressed these trees enough to where no matter how much moisture is now available for them, the roots have died back too much, the vascular tissues have died back too much. We don't know. So we're trying to investigate this further. What we're looking for is more information about how much is this distributed on the landscape. It's really hard for us to pick this up in aerial surveys. I tried this summer. I'd been to these sites on the ground and I knew where to look. From the plane, I can't see it. It's usually because these trees have overstory covering them up, and also because it doesn't have a very distinct looking crown from the plane. So it's really hard for us to pick up. So if you know of pockets of red cedar, give me a lat long, give me an approximate acreage. That's all I need. I throw it on the map, go ground check it. It becomes one of our survey sites, or we at least have a distribution map. So we are looking into this. We do have a grant with the Forest Service to try and study it more extensively, and hopefully that gets funded this year. Big leaf maple is also in decline in many areas in which it should be thriving. Big leaf maple is a hardy tree, does well at moist sites, does well at dry sites, but we're seeing leaf scorch, top kill in a lot of areas, and we, again, don't know why. There potentially could be an insect vectoring a disease, that's one thing, but we're thinking it's more so abiotic factors because the insect has not been isolated at every site. And then grand fir, as we've mentioned, that's declining in a lot of areas as well. And that's the gallery that I was talking about in that center picture with fir engraver. Once you see it, you can't not see it. All those little slashes are really apparent, but that is just telling you that something is happening with that tree and that insect just took advantage of it. This tree does a really good job of recovering from fir engraver attacks. So when they're that extensive, though, there's no coming back from that. So something is allowing that tree to just be hit by insects over and over. It's not recovering. It's not able to defend itself from subsequent attacks. It's a lot of words up there. You don't have to read it. It's a very simple principle. It's that you always have one factor that comes in. That's the primary factor, and then there are other factors that add on to it. It's this additive effect. So that's why I said, don't look at treating the insect or the disease. 80% of the cases, they're opportunistic, taking advantage of a different stressful situation. In this case that we're talking about today, climate change and drought. Treat that, and then you treat for those secondaries. But everything that comes in reduces the resistance and tolerance more and more. Okay, so what do we need to tell our clients for management? You know a lot of these things, but maybe people aren't doing all of these things. Takes more than just, okay, I did some thinning, that's good. There's more to it than that. Don't assume this is a short-term problem. I have a lot of clients that don't want to be told that it's human caused. That's fine. I'm not here to change your mind on that. But I am here to tell you that we are seeing this evidence already, that we have a changing climate. You must at least agree on that point. Even if you don't, what's the harm in planning for it? Because you're going to be in great shape either way if you plan for it. If you don't plan for it, you're out of luck. So assume that this is going to be ongoing, and that's what the numbers are showing us, that even though we have some good years, we're also going to have some bad years. The overall trend is increasing temperature, reduced precipitation in the quantity and the timing that we need it. Plant the right species in the right place. Taking a step further, look at the genotypes. Look at the cultivars that you're planting, and think about where you're planting them in terms of the microclimate in your landscape. We need to be making decisions on a smaller scale rather than I need to apply this principle across my entire ownership. Well, think about where you're planting things. Promote resilience. That is key. Promote the resilience of your trees, and then you're going to promote the resilience against insects and diseases. Anticipate and plan for associated insects and diseases, so you know what your host trees are. Have the short list of what are the major insects and diseases that I should look out for that could be coming my way. And what kind of things do they like? So bark beetles, they really like drought-stressed trees. If you know the main bark beetles that are coming in for your trees, you know what the stress factor they're going after. then you know how to prevent that. So if you have a bunch of Doug-fir, you know that Doug-fir beetle really likes blowdown. Take care of your blowdown right after winter, after that happens, because that's an insect that could be coming in for it. If you have grand fir and it is very drought intolerant, and you know fir engraver could come in and take it out, okay, well, reduce the component of grand fir in some areas that are more drought, at risk for drought. Managing pine slash and Doug-fir blowdown. This is, again, knowing the insects that come after certain species. Pine gets attacked regularly by insects that really like slash. So just be aware of that, because timing of your management decisions really has an impact. If you are doing any sort of thinning in your pine stand, for example, to try and promote the resilience for drought, when you're doing that thinning, pay attention to what you do with all that slash material. There's an insect that likes to get into it. So great, you did all the thinning, but then you also put out a bunch of bait for the beetles that are going to take out the rest of your leaf trees. So be aware of those insects that are going to go after the host that you're growing and the situations that will ramp them up. Increased diversity, we know this. Yeah, let's answer that before you. No, I just mentioned that. So pine slash and yeah. And so the Doug-fir beetle slide that I showed earlier, Doug-fir beetle likes to get into large diameter Doug-fir, and when we have a winter blowdown event, the beetles they start flying in April, and they'll start attacking that blowdown. They build up in that, and then they'll spread to adjacent standing trees right after.
What do you think the solution is for?
Removing all that down material or applying MCH before that first April, before they can get in the logs, or before the second April when they get into the adjacent standing trees.
Sounds like some new FSC rules. Because we've been encouraging blowdown.
How do you encourage blowdown?
It's a good thing to have blowdown and leave it alone.
Right. Okay. So it's
Ecological value.
it is of ecological value, absolutely, and that's why you can do things like applying MCH, so you can leave it on the ground. But this is an anti-aggregation repellent, so it basically just tells the beetles disperse on the landscape rather than concentrating in a certain area. So you can fulfill both objectives. MCH should be approved, yes.
You're seeing this kind of in Lane County and Douglas County, and we got some of it where we are. Where a lot
Yes.
of blowdown.
So this past year, we had a lot of blowdown, and so around those,
It's amazing.
yeah, and so look at those perimeters. The next year or two, you're going to start seeing trees that are taken out around those perimeters, because beetles are lazy. They just want to fly to the next closest tree. They'll pop out from the down material, and they'll get into the standing trees. And I can talk more with you about that. I didn't include a lot of the material that can be found in our fact sheets, because it's overwhelming. But I can talk with you about what some of your options are for keeping some of that material, because we do want wildlife habitat, but we also don't want to encourage susceptibility to insect pests. Increased diversity, we know this, and it's not just species diversity, it's genotype diversity. So when we're talking about, if anybody's thinking about doing assisted migration, hog and throw in a whole bunch of this one genotype, maybe slowly fill in with different species, different genotypes, but diversify. Don't fertilize, as was mentioned. That increases growth requirements. That increases moisture. There really aren't a lot of cases, especially in industrial or even the larger small private woodland owners' lots, to fertilize. So avoid that if you can during drought periods. Manage understory weeds. We know this. Long, slow, maintained irrigation. So some people have the ability to irrigate. That's great, but it needs to be done in the right quantity over the right period of time. Not a dump of water. It needs to be long and slow. Give those trees time to pull it up. And if you start a regimen of irrigation, you better stay on it, because then those trees get used to that level of irrigation. So don't commit to it unless you can fully commit to it over the long term. Thinning is really important. So we have all kinds of tables out there. They're species specific on what your thinning levels should be, what your stocking levels in the first place should be. That depends on what your reentry time is. You know, what materials, resources do you have to stay on top of your thinning? There's usually a range, D plus whatever number based on your site index. Go towards the end of the range that goes towards a wider spacing to account for future drought scenarios. But also when doing your thinning, again, don't go in there and apply your management really eagerly. So don't do a massive thinning all at once. You're going to leave the remaining trees are then going to be sun exposed. There's sun scald factors. There's going to be drying of the soil. So you want to do thinning, but you don't want to do anything too hard or too fast. Don't shock your system. And avoid extensive work and mechanical damage during droughts. It's really easy to ignore the fact that trees get damaged really easily. They are long-lived. They're very healthy, or they're very strong when they're healthy, but if you're running equipment through an area during the wrong time of year, you could be opening gashes in that tree that allow fungus in, or cutting off vascular tissues that they're going to need later. So do your management delicately. I know that trees seem like they can take a lot, but they've already been taking a lot since 2012, so let's go easy on them. And I'm just going to give you some resources really quickly here. This is a map of soil drought prediction, so probability of dryness. You can see the chart in the back here. All I'm trying to show you is that you know where the problem areas have been. Southwest Oregon's a big one, central into parts of Northeast Oregon. You see the valley has not a lot of data, and that's an unfortunate thing. There's a lot of missing data for the valley, but I will tell you that the Willamette Valley, despite all the agriculture you see, that there are a lot of things growing and thriving, it is an intermittently wet system. It is very dry, it is at high risk, it's a really stressed system, and there's a lot of moisture being lost to urban and agricultural needs. And so those environments, especially if you're in the WUI, are at high risk. And so utilize this information, know what your soil type is, know if it's a patchwork, then you need to think about that in terms of your species distribution on the landscape. Your species choice and where you're planting it is really important. Okay, I'm going to blow your mind here. This is a lot of links, I get it, but you're going to get these presentations. So you'll have these links. Just skip through them. There might be some things you've already seen here, but these are great resources. A lot of people do a lot of work, and it's up to you to read this stuff and then explain it to your clients. Don't expect them to already be aware of it. It's our job to communicate that stuff in very easy to understand, clear language. That's how you actually apply change on the landscape, is educating people. So with that, thank you very much for your patience. That was a lot, so thank you.